The management of religious affairs and maintenance of social harmony when it comes to religion in China is an incredibly nuanced topic. This topic impacts people of all faiths in China, though today we'll be focusing on Christianity in particular. In order to do so, we'll be focusing on the three largest denominations of Christianity in China, namely Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Three-Self Patriotic movement. Before diving into the lived experience of the different Christian denominations within China, it is important to understand broad trends in geographic distribution for today's Chinese Christians. Rural areas in particular have seen both a resurgence and a decline. On the one hand, resurgence. Since 2000, these rural areas have seen churches reopening, which has coincided with the greater freedom, or at least tolerance, to practicing Christianity, stemming in large part from 1980s religious policies within China. However, there has also been a decline. In rural areas across China, millions of people migrate into the cities to look for work, which has led to a, quote, gradual hollowing out of the rural Christian community, end quote, and a decline in the number of people attending church services, as well as a perception that the church is more of a, quote, old folks club or a, quote, women's club. In essence, in the rural areas, we see that there has been a reopening of these churches, though at the same time there may not be as many people to attend these churches, as generally people have moved towards the cities. These cities play an important part in understanding the demographic distribution of Christianity in China. As China embraced the global markets in the 1990s, cities generally saw upticks in Christianity. A driving factor behind this was that increasingly Chinese citizens, though not necessarily the Chinese government, no longer saw Christianity as a foreign, Western imperialist religion, but instead as a, quote, prestigious religion that symbolizes modernity and cosmopolitanism, end quote. A coincidental factor to embracing the global markets was an internal suppression of dissent and tightening of political control as China showed itself to the world. As such, some Chinese citizens, quote, disenchanted with communist ideology, turned to Christianity as a viable source of religious and moral certitude, end quote. The exact composition of urban Christians in China is a continually developing story. Since the 1990s, there has been an interplay between urban Christians and rural migrant Christians, though recently, most urban Christian converts are from the, quote, elite strata of Chinese society, consisting of successful business people, university students, and professionals, end quote. A third domain also exists, transcending beyond the scope of urban and rural areas: the digital domain. While the Chinese Communist Party is able to monitor and censor online content with tools such as the Great Firewall, the digital domain remains a place of continued interaction amongst Chinese Christians. This line is a difficult line to walk for many Chinese Christians, and as a result, they must balance a tightrope of both appearing as patriotic Chinese netizens while also cultivating their identities as pious Christians. Per the Regulation on Religion 2018, these practices are oftentimes illegal since they do not typically receive approval by the religious affairs departments of government above the province level. For a final note on demography, a broad understanding of the Christian population is necessary. Pew Research estimates that in 2021, accounting for the reduced scope of the survey due to the COVID-19 pandemic in China, potentially 2% of China's population, or around 30 million people, are Christian, though some sources push that number up to as high as 9%, or 125.47 million people. The vast majority are Protestant. And out of the at least 26 million Protestant Christians in China, 70% of them live in rural areas. Furthermore, it is estimated that up to 80% of house church members in China are female, likely due in part to the demolition of Confucian patriarchal systems during the Cultural Revolution. This is likely also a reason why rural Christian churches are culturally regarded as women's clubs. And finally, as a result of the dispersed nature of Christianity in China, there is an acute problem of not having enough pastors and educated ministers to meet the needs of the entire Chinese Christian population. Moving now towards the different denominations in modern Chinese Christianity, it is important to note, as with all religions in China, Christianity is tolerated as long as it is kept under the monitor of the Chinese government. These denominations present a challenge to the Chinese government, and that is of foreign, which can also be read as non-Chinese, influence. As such, we will now begin to discuss the lived experience of the three major denominations in China: Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Three Self-Patriotic movement. Catholicism in China is largely consolidated under the China Catholic Patriotic Church, the CCPC, also sometimes called the China Catholic Patriotic Association, or CCPA. Notably, it is not largely consolidated under the Holy See in the Vatican. Now, this led to a situation where in September 2018, Pope Francis signed an agreement with the Chinese government to appeal to the underground churches to unify with the CCPC, which led to many of these underground bishops stepping down in favor of bishops appointed by the CCPC. Two things are important to note regarding this situation. First is that these underground churches are not necessarily literally underground, more so that they do not approve of CCPC and or governmental oversight, and as such do not conform to traditional church structure. Second, it is important to understand that despite being appointed by the Chinese government, many Catholic clergy in the CCPC are indeed devout Christians and not necessarily trying to push a Chinese Communist Party agenda on the church. This nuance means that for many Catholic clergy in China, their lived daily experience consists of, quote, playing according to the rules in order to cultivate good relationships with local governments, avoid the suspicion of authorities, and to protect their own communities, end quote. Ultimately, all of this is an effort to foster an image of Catholics being patriotic Chinese citizens so that they can safeguard their ability to practice Christianity, as in reality, quote, the open church has little choice but to follow the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, end quote. This brings a dichotomy to the Catholic Church in China, as many of the policies enacted by the state are targeted at clergy members and not necessarily at the non-clergy practitioners of the faith, the laity. Of course, there are policies that impact the day-to-day practicing of religion just broadly in China, but, quote, the clergy are more directly influenced by the regulation and any top-down changes as they are the people who organize the church and its activities. The laity can be considered more as passive agents than active agents, end quote. So while the Catholic clergy certainly faces challenges, as alluded to, the laity has a little bit more maneuver room. For example, the Church of Little Rome was rebuilt in a village in Guangdong province with funding from members of the Hakka diaspora. This church was not merely built for religious reasons. Villagers used religion in this case to pursue modern development while they dealt with topics such as, quote, economic migration, consumption, and nation-state building, end quote, as a broader part of their interpretation and experience of being modern in the contemporary world. However, the tightening of control by the government on the church projects a relatively bleak outlook for the CCPC's trajectory of religious freedom. As the regulation on religious affairs has tightened restrictions, and during the Xi Jinping era of governance, there's been a tightening of the PRC's Article 5 of the Constitution that pronounces the rule of law, or Fa in Mandarin. One of the hardest hit denominations is and will be the CCPC, due to their already stringent oversight by the Chinese government. In this instance, the hierarchical nature of the CCPC has led to a situation ripe for government oversight and control. And to this end, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has instituted a clergy database that monitors and tracks how closely clergy members follow CCP regulations. And so, especially sparked by events such as Pope John Paul II's canonization of Chinese martyrs, a yearly feast on July 9th that is marked in remembrance of 120 Catholic martyrs from China, such as Augustine Jiaorong. The Chinese government has seen this event and deemed that foreign influence of the Catholic Church cannot be ignored and therefore must be conformed to Chinese rule of law. This idea of foreign influence in the Chinese Catholic Church specifically is one of the driving factors, in fact, the main factor for all of the stringent rules and regulations surrounding the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Church, and therefore underpinning the relatively bleak trajectory of religious freedom for Catholics in China. Moving now to Protestant Christianity in China, referred to as Jidujiao, or the Jesus religion in Chinese. Protestantism is the largest of the three denominations, and in part this is because of a few institutional features of Protestantism. One feature that works well with Protestantism in China is the fact that there is an insistence on church autonomy, so there's not typically a bigger superstructure above local churches. Another factor that works very well for Protestantism in China is a global support network. So what I talked about earlier, how the Chinese Communist Party, fearing global influence or international and foreign influence in the church, well, Protestantism, since it is more decentralized, has a better access and a less restricted access to that outside world. And finally, there's other factors, for example, the glorification of martyrdom, that all come to play together in essentially making Protestantism, as it is now, the largest of the denominations in China. Now, if you've heard about Christianity in China, you've likely heard of the house church movement. This is a pretty strong pillar in the Protestant movement writ large in China, and is very similar to the underground church movement for Catholic Christians in China, essentially not formally registering with the government. Now, the house church movement typically takes place in people's houses where sermons and lectures and Christianity is practiced. Now, for that, this house church movement comes with benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, the lack of governmental oversight allows for Protestants to practice a relatively more free version of Christianity because they're not being overseen by the government. On the other hand, the Chinese government views this Protestantism, and specifically the house church movement, with intense suspicion, not only because of the lack of direct government oversight, but also due to the connections that Protestant groups have within China with countries such as South Korea and the United States, and therefore the Protestant movements in those countries. As a result, arrests and even torture of Protestant leaders in China is not entirely uncommon. In recent memory, this has looked like the arrest of Pastor Wang Yi in 2018 for his part in authoring a statement against the 2018 Regulation on Religious Affairs, as well as Pastor Geng Zijun in 2022 due to his affiliation with the broader house church movement. Despite the hardships, many Protestant Christians continue to practice their faith in China. For example, many Protestant Christians use their places of work as a place to practice their religion. For example, working to change workplace culture, engaging with coworkers through the lens of Protestant Christianity, which ultimately kind of blurs the line a little bit between occupation and religion, with the ultimate aim of a moral transformation of China through the means of Christianity. Now, this is not entirely a united movement or a united front. Due to the decentralized structure of Protestantism in China, there's a kaleidoscope of approaches to the interdenominational and even inter-Protestant cooperation and coordination. As Protestant churches spread throughout China in the post-Mao era, they took on forms and shapes of their own. Some Protestant churches in China are Calvinist, some are Pentecostal, and some are exclusionary, while others work with the Three Self-Patriotic movement or even the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Church. So this fragmentary nature of Protestantism compounds the aforementioned weakness of the general non-hierarchical structure of Christianity in China. Simply put, Protestant Christians in China do not necessarily have a broad unity of effort in the same way that, say, Chinese Catholics do, nor do they have that unified support network to fall back on. And as a result, the Chinese government continues to heavily scrutinize and conduct coercive actions against Protestant groups. Last group that we'll look at in particular before giving some broad overall strokes is the Three Self-Patriotic movement, or the 三自爱国运动, which literally translates to Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Now, the TSPM, as it's also referred to, represents a bit of an enigma for Christianity outside of China. It's technically a Protestant denomination in a very loose sense of the word, as it's not Catholic. It was formed in 1954, and it is the official non-Catholic church in China, and generally stands today as a counterpoint to the Protestant churches previously mentioned. Some notes on that is that the church is and was led by the CCP, and to that end, the original slogan of the TSPM was "Love Country, love church. The ordering of that phrase is highly intentional, the fact that country comes before church. Now, certainly the CCP has exerted immense control over the TSPM, and to that end, an article of union among the TSPM stated that, among other not traditionally Christian edicts, quote, all books used in the interpretation of the Bible shall be examined and judged. Only teachings favoring union and socialism shall be used. There shall be no more teaching about the last day or about the vanity of this world. End quote. Now, to paint the Three Self-Patriotic movement as a merely brutish attempt by the CCP to exert its power and influence over Christians in China is not a nuanced enough picture. Similar to how the Catholic clergy are kind of playing according to the rules in order to shirk attention and find breathing room to actually truly practice their faith, the same can be said for many TSPM practitioners. That being said, there is a general trend in the TSPM to view themselves as a main source of Protestant orthodoxy within China, alongside the CCPC as the main source for Catholic orthodoxy. In other words, they see themselves, the TSPM, as the correct way of doing Christianity as it relates to the Protestant sphere of influence. Now, this view of itself is a factor that spreads mistrust between the TSPM and non-TSPM Protestant house churches, as the TSPM maintains a level of awareness of the so-called heterodox tendencies of other denominations, and again paints itself as the orthodox way of practicing Christianity through Protestantism within China. Despite everything, though, despite generally falling in line with the CCP, despite having massive CCP oversight and structure there, not even the TSPM has been spared violent action against it by the Chinese state. For example, in 1973, Three Self-Patriotic movement Pastor Wang Zhiming, an early TSPM advocate, was publicly executed alongside 21 other Christians. Further, during the Cultural Revolution, overt practices of Christianity, to include the TSPM, were so non-existent to the point where Mao Zedong's wife exclaimed that, quote, Chinese Christianity was finished and belonged in the History Museum, end quote. Other injustices have been conducted against the Three Self-Patriotic movement. For example, there have been TSPM churches that have had their crosses removed, though, of course, this is a commonality amongst all Chinese Christian denominations. That being said, though, the TSPM has proved resilient as the CCP sees use to the institution, and TSPM practitioners see this specific denomination as a valid way of exercising their faith. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit here about the broad-lived interdenominational experience, so experiences common to Christians of any denomination in China, and then talk about some of the challenges that they face, as well as Christianity's current standing in China. One generally shared experience is the fact that, at least among the common people in China, Christianity is not necessarily considered a foreign religion anymore, which is a rather remarkable change that has come with over 1,400 years of intermittent contact between China and Christianity. Simply put, Chinese Christianity did not stick for, as I mentioned in the last video, 3 out of 4 major phases of sustained contact since 635 CE. And as such, the fact that there is a trend towards Christianity be considered not just a foreign religion, but now another Chinese religion represents a historical anomaly. One other experience that is common across denominations is the fact that Chinese Christians have been very creative in finding ways to meet. I mentioned earlier that the digital world provides one avenue of approach for Chinese Christians to meet, though of course in the face of CCP resistance. Another avenue has been the renting and co-opting of commercial spaces, even though, again, this practice is widely illegal. To this end, there have been Christian protests of government crackdowns on religious venues. This was openly showcased in 2001 when members of the Shouwang Church were forced to leave their church. As a result, they protested by holding outdoor services. This points to another general trend among all Christian denominations in China. They have, quote, with varying degrees of agency, creativity, and autonomy, have either accommodated, resisted, or co-opted the party state through innovations in theology, organization structure, technology, ritual practices, and transnational social networks, end quote. As for specific challenges that Christians face in China, it is not unfair to say that modern Chinese Christians face levels of persecution unseen in the West. In modern China, these anti-Christian acts are committed in line with Xi Jinping's 2019 policy of Sinicization that seeks to ensure that all religions in China understand that the Chinese Communist Party is first, and any actions taken by religious groups must conform to socialist societal practices. This comes in tandem with an uptick in specifically anti-Christian acts by the CCP to include, quote, church raids, confiscation of church property and personal assets of Christians, demolitions of churches, political vetting of seminary students, and torture of clergy and laity, end quote, in both official and unofficial capacities. Technology also plays a role in the lives of Chinese Christians. For example, churches are required to have facial ID, and compounding this small fact of facial ID when you walk into a church and check in is the fact that a lot of the infrastructure that was used initially to track COVID-19 in China, such as telephone tracking, surveillance cameras, and, as I mentioned, the facial ID outside of churches, are now being used to track underground and home churches as well. Another method of tracking Christians in China comes in the form of the previously mentioned clergy database, where, quote, Christian leaders are ordered to swear loyalty to the CCP and conform the content of their homilies to the party line, and churches and religious organizations are required to report the conduct of their religious leaders to local authorities, who in turn would administer the clergy's rewards and punishment register to them in the database, end quote. Now, this is being conducted in an effort to ensure that only politically sound individuals, as according to the CCP, are allowed to attend and participate in official Christian activities. This mixing of government and religion is not merely external. It's not just something that stops once you go through the church doors of whatever denomination you happen to practice in China. The CCP demands that churches sing the national anthem and give praise to CCP leaders before worship. This internal meddling by the CCP goes further. Churches are required to substitute Christian iconography for portraits of Xi Jinping and are required to, quote, notify the Religious Affairs Department of personnel changes as well as important meetings, activities, trainings, and international communications, end quote. On top of all of this, and as aforementioned, arrests, physical harassment and violence, as well as psychological harassment perpetrated by the CCP are not uncommon if a member or a congregation steps outside of the party line. This has been recognized within China, again, as I mentioned, with numerous arrests of Chinese pastors and clergy from every denomination, though it has also been recognized outside of China. Places like the Vatican, for example, have recognized it by Pope John Paul's recognition of Chinese martyrs, or more recently, the United States State Department calling for the release of arrested pastors such as Wang Yi. In conclusion for this video and this little mini-series, the research available suggests a nuanced picture of Christianity in China, from its history and all the way down to the lived experience of Chinese Christians today. We see that Christianity in China is certainly a difficult road for Chinese Christians to navigate. On one hand, there is systemic and targeted persecution of Christians by Chinese authorities, though on the other, the fact that Christianity has maintained its presence in China suggests that despite the hardships and the challenges associated with practicing the faith, there are aspects of Christianity that are worth it to tens of millions of Chinese citizens. To this end, and despite the hardship, Christianity continues to grow in China. And as long as the CCP finds Christianity in line, or at least manageable with social harmony, as they would put it, in addition to modernization, a return to the pre-1976 massively widespread and overt targeting of Christians will likely be avoided, and Christianity's growth in China will be sustained. One final point that I'd like to leave you with comes from Ye 2023, where they note the general resiliency of Chinese Christians rather succinctly. Quote, 3 times in history Christianity came and died, and 3 times it came back